Who are the heroes of today? Who are the protagonists of our cultural myths? Are they symbols of naked ambition? Do they act good? Or are they merely good at acting? Have we become a society of anti-heroes? And how do we, as writers and artists, write fiction that reflects the madness of the world around us? These are some of the questions that we shall not be discussing today, but if you're new to the channel, hi, my name's Josh. In the past, I've made some very opinionated video essays, kind of critiquing where culture is heading, and I may do some of that still, but my focus is definitely now making more pragmatic and helpful videos for writers to give them some food for thought, because ultimately, at the end of the day, that is all YouTube videos are good for. These are not Bibles. They're not even fortune cookies. These are just places to go, probably while you're eating your breakfast, to just sort of daydream a bit about your own project, whatever it may be. Hopefully this video just puts some wind in your sails and sends you back into the seas of your own creativity. So today I want to ask a really big and important question, which is, what makes for a good main character in fiction? Here's a bold claim. All stories are about characters. They're about human beings, or at least objects that we can understand in human terms. Now, if you're anything like me, then nailing character, really rendering on the page a character who is believable, who is distinct, who has consistent worldviews that manifests as flaws that make them make the wrong decisions sometimes, and yet they're not so wrong that they're hard to identify with and enjoy your time with. They're still sort of endearing on some level and interesting. You know, they're specific characters, someone you've never seen in another piece of fiction. You know, that's the hardest part of writing. Maybe you are like me in the sense that I might crack out an outline for a plot in a couple hours, in an afternoon maybe. And yeah, maybe it's provisional, things will change, it's a little general in sections, but I get an idea of what the plot looks like, where we're going, what the main conflict is, what the big beats of that story are. That's not necessarily all too hard. What's hard, and what takes sometimes years of painstaking work, reflection, and rewriting, is character, is the people who bring that plot to life, the people whose choices make that plot happen. So let's just start with one of the biggest pieces of bullshit that you will find from certain writing teachers or people who give you notes on your writing, or writing YouTubers like me. The idea is that you have to write a character that your audience will like. It's obviously not true. No one has to do anything. Okay, but even if you have aspirations to be a commercially successful writer with a broad audience, this may seem like good advice. Well, take any story with an anti-hero for evidence that this isn't necessarily true. And there are some stories with anti-heroes that are very commercially successful, don't forget. Anti-heroes are not necessarily outright villains, but they are not moral role models. Or maybe they just subvert expectations of heroism. But keep in mind that the existence and the popularity of anti-heroes implies the expectations of heroism are universally understood. So that means collectively we have some intuitive, deep understanding of what heroism is. So what is heroism? Is it simply being good? Some critics don't think heroism is inherently good at all. For example, the psychoanalytic film critic Laura Mulvey associates heroism with boyish fantasy. She uses Freud's insight that His Majesty the ego is the hero of every daydream and every story. So heroism is associated with being the main character of a story, because the ego is the main character of the psyche. Okay, but Mulvey picks up on Freud's subtle gendering of the ego. It's His Majesty the ego. And she adds this: although a boy might know quite well that it is most unlikely that he will go out into the world, make his fortune through prowess or the assistance of helpers, and marry a princess, the stories describe the male fantasy of ambition, reflecting something of an experience and expectation of dominance, in brackets, the active. The Jungian mythologists, Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette, in their landmark book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, also link the concept of the hero to what they call boy psychology. And they claim that the hero often dies at the end of the story or otherwise goes away because they claim that this is symbolic of the end of boyhood, the boy making way for the man. They write, if we are possessed by the hero, we will fall under the negative aspect of this energy. Now, throughout their work, they talk about archetypal energies like the hero possessing people. And in their minds, that's not a good thing. You don't want to be possessed by the archetypes. You're not a balanced person when you are possessed by one archetype. A balanced person has many different energies. They have the king, the warrior, the lover, and the magician all coexisting within the same psyche. So keep that in mind with this quote. When you're possessed by the hero, you may fall under its shadow. We will walk over others in our insensitivity and arrogance and eventually self-destruct. If we are in the passive pole of the hero's bipolar shadow, notice that they're not saying the shadow of the hero is one thing. They're saying it's a bipolar shadow. It can go one of two ways. One is this bully archetype, and the other is the passive pole. If we are in the passive pole, possessed by the coward, we will lack the motivation to achieve anything of significance for human life. But if we access the hero energy appropriately, we will push ourselves up against our limitations. We will adventure to the frontiers of what we can be as boys. And from there, if we can make the transition, we will be prepared for our initiation into manhood. Okay, we got into the heavy theory pretty quickly with this one, so let's just pause for a second and back up and ask a more basic question. Does this mean that all heroes are men? Or not even men, but teenage boys? The simple answer is no. We are not talking about maleness, but masculinity. We're talking about the active principle in nature, what the Taoists call yang energy. Historically, yeah, it's coded as male, but what we're talking about is an energy that anyone can embody in either its shadow or its balanced forms.
When I was young, I was always a go-with-the-flow kind of avatar. People seemed to work out their own problems, and there was peace and good times in the world. But then, I lost the woman I loved to Ko, the face stealer. It was my fault. If I had been more attentive and more active, I could have saved her.
But the gendered aspect of these quotes above is not what interests me the most. There is something common to Freud's, Mulvey's, and Moore and Gillette's quotes. And that is the idea of the active. It's the assumption that heroism is defined by its activity, by its extroverted motion outward into the world where it does things. Therefore, I think the best definition of heroism is where good intention meets good action. It's not enough for a hero to want good or to discuss good. A hero must do good.
Superman does good. You doing well.
So is that it? Is that all there is to say? That all it takes to write an interesting main character is to have them do things? There's a bit more to it than that. Why is it that it's so easy to write a story full of characters and have your main character be the most bland of them all? Maybe it's because we want to create a character that is a sort of everyman, someone who pretty much anyone reading the book can identify with and understand, while the side characters, we feel like we can go a little crazier and make them a little more eccentric, a little more unique. Yeah, something like that. But it's something to resist. It's something to be aware of, that we all fall into this trap of making our main character the least interesting character. That doesn't mean that you have to go and make your main character off-the-wall eccentric. Maybe you should, but not every story needs that. What you need to do is to define your character well. Okay, how do you do that? How do you just define your character? Do you just pick out of a hat? Okay, here's what their worldview will be. The end goal should never be simply to just have an interesting character for the sake of it. The end goal should be to create a character who is perfectly suited to the story that they're in. It is my firm belief that you don't create a protagonist out of nothing. You create a protagonist and the story hand in hand. They're meant to go together.
Get out.
Some of us are intuitive geniuses when it comes to coming up with characters. Some people just have a real sense of how humans work. They have a real sense of who their protagonist is, and they actually build a story around the protagonist and start with them and their worldview and all the rest of it. If that's you, then you don't need any advice from me. You need help with plot, probably. For the rest of us, sometimes we start with a bigger picture, the sort of God's eye perspective, the outside in. Rather than starting with a character, we might start with a theme that we want to explore, or a message we want to convey, or maybe we start with some cool locations we want the characters to go through, or often we start with one or two key moments in the plot that we feel we could construct a whole story around. It is amazing how vast a forest one can grow with just a few of such seeds, and also how easily one can get lost in that forest. If you ever feel yourself getting lost in your own forest, if you feel like you're bending a character to make them fit a plot you've constructed for them, and you lose touch with who this person is and what they want and what they believe, then just ask yourself these questions. How do you want it to feel? How do you want your work of art to feel to the audience? Forget about what you want to convey intellectually. Just think about how you want it to feel. And forget the details, right? Forget individual trees. Just try to see the forest. How should it feel to walk through that forest? If you're doing a long work like a novel or a feature film or a TV series or something, of course there's going to be multiple different feelings throughout the course of it. So we're speaking generally here, and maybe more specifically about the ending, how you want people to walk away feeling. Once you have the answer to that question, ask this: how can I ground that feeling into a single moment of human drama? Another way to approach this question is to ask, what is the heroic or the anti-heroic action that they take at the climax? If you don't know the answer to that, then spend some more time working on your plot and figure that out. Because that choice is the seed of the character. That's the given. That's what you start knowing about this character. You know they must do that thing. And you want that action, that thing that they do at the climax, to have the maximum emotional and intellectual impact possible. And the good news is that those of us who are not intuitive geniuses when it comes to creating character can rationally reverse engineer your character from that seed. Because you do want your climax to hit, right? I mean, you do want your writing to have impact, right? You want your audience to get invested in the story and to dream alongside its unfolding and care about your protagonist, right? I mean, it's a genuine question. It's not a rhetorical question. Do you want that? Because there's many different types of writing. Maybe your work isn't so Wagnerian, so epic, so operatic. Maybe it's a bit more subtle, a bit more contained. Maybe you're writing a chamber drama. But even in that case, you still want your audience to care about the character, right? You still want them to walk away with some kind of feeling, right? I mean, you want them to like it, right? Because some people don't. Some people don't want the audience to like their work. Sometimes you're supposed to hate a work of art, and that's the point. Or maybe not hate it per se, but the work is supposed to disturb you, or frustrate you, bore you, confuse you. There's no rules against doing that. All I'm saying is that you, the creator of the work, must be absolutely 100% crystal clear about your own intentions. You have to be honest with yourself about why you're spending all of your time working on this project instead of playing, 6 hours of tower defense games per day. I mean, why get off your ass and be proactive and make something for yourself instead of just being a passive consumer of other people's art? What's important to you? Why are you doing this? What are you trying to share with the world? What are you trying to contribute to this human experiment? It sounds crazy, but I've done it. You've probably done it. I'm sure George Lucas has done it. Everyone's done it. We put pen to paper and we start playing around, and then before we know it, we're working on something, and we don't stop to think what it is or why we're doing it, or, you know, if this one moment is actually supposed to be funny or not, or if this other moment is supposed to be scary or not, or most importantly, what you truly believe in your heart of hearts about the theme you're discussing. It's so easy to just play this game of being sort of nihilistic and cynical and making fun of what other people believe. It's so much harder to be honest with yourself and actually ask, what am I trying to communicate here? What do I actually believe? It reminds me of this thing that C.S. Lewis said once, and I love to quote this anytime I can, so here it is. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent, because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. What if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as to not see. I think it was Mary Robinette from the Writing Excuses podcast who pointed out that short stories are largely about concept. They're about an idea being presented and how it's presented, style. While novels are about immersion. It's about a reader getting really immersed into a world and the events happening in it. I would say the same is generally true of short films versus feature films. Although I would point out that the two poles, the conceptual and the dramatic, are always in some kind of tension. It's never an either or, choosing one or the other. It's always about a type of balance. So if you are primarily a storyteller and you're trying to learn the craft of telling stories that get audiences deeply invested and make it easy for them to say, you know, cry at the end of your story and be moved and be changed by your story, then you have to subscribe and you have to like and comment. No, but you have to make a main character who is not a total drag to be around, not someone who's abrasive and annoying or opaque, someone that your audience doesn't necessarily love, but they love to spend time with. So essentially what I'm saying is you do need a hero at the heart of your tale. You might be thinking, that's a really cute cat behind you. Now you might be thinking, I already know all this, Josh. I already know that it's worth having a good character. You've just sat and stood here convincing me that I should have good characters. Like, I already know all that. The real question is how? How do you make a character that people like? Well, the jig is up. There is no YouTube video, there is no book on writing, there is no lecture that can tell you what to do. All we can do is help you see the options before you and help you think about what direction you want to go in. Because remember, there is no surefire, always true, one-size-fits-all advice for writing. But with that said, there actually are sometimes some surefire, always true, one-size-fits-all advice for writing. Sometimes, yeah. One of them is this: you should give your character a legible worldview at the start of your story.
Mom, you say the biggest problem in this universe is nobody helps each other.
Another surefire piece of advice is to define your character by their relationships with other characters. No man is an island, right? And people are not that interesting until you see them interacting with other people. That really brings out how they contrast with other people, how their beliefs might clash. But even before you get into all that, there is an even more basic, surefire, always true, one-size-fits-all advice for crafting a good main character, and it is this: don't make them passive. If you've been writing for a while and you've submitted some writing to a contest or an agent or a friendly reader even, most likely you have at some point received feedback that had something to do with the passivity versus the activity of your protagonist. It is one of the most common notes that readers give. And maybe like me, you have wondered why this is the case. Why do you need an active protagonist? Speaking now as someone who was once an untrained writer and now is a trained writer and a professional reader. By the way, if you want notes from me, hit up me on hit me up on my website in the description below. I'll give you notes on your reading. I'll give you notes on your writing. I can confidently say that the hallmark of the amateur or the untrained writer is a lack of activity from the protagonist. Often, new writers will write a protagonist who is little more than a spectator, like the audience themselves, rather than an author, like the author themselves. Young people in particular write protagonists like this, and I think because that's how it feels to be a child sometimes. You're living life in the passenger seat. But if you take a moment to think about the stories you love, the ones that stuck with you, the most engaging, memorable, and exciting stories, they are always about characters who are pushed outside of their comfort zones and who have no choice but to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. Many are called, but few get up.
Many are called, but few get up.
And we tend to tell the stories about those few who get up. About Ulysses, about Achilles, about Luke, about Frodo, Nausicaa, Howard. We might rebel against this tradition and we might say, well, like, hang on a second, there's always exceptions to every rule. And we might point to some examples of passive protagonists. We might bring up Indiana Jones 1, or Hitchcock's I Confess, or Being There, or Fool's Paradise. But the question of what is passive versus active is actually a bit more nuanced than that. And I would actually argue that of those 4 films I just mentioned, only one of them has an actually truly passive protagonist. So let's go through them. Indiana Jones 1. So people often point out that the plot of Indiana Jones proceeds with or without Indiana being involved, that none of his choices really steer the development or impact the climax of the film. But here's my counter argument. First of all, it's not just about the climax. The shape of the narrative is not just about the climax, okay? But this argument really helps us make a very clear distinction, which is that narrative agency is not the same thing as activity. Indiana Jones is very active. He is anything but passive. And even if you buy the argument that the end would remain the same without him, that somehow the Ark of the Covenant would end up in American hands without his involvement, even if you believe that, then this is an argument about narrative agency, not about activity versus passivity. Narrative agency is about the power of a character's choices to steer the chain of cause and effect that leads to the outcome. Anyway, that conversation could go on for a while, so let's move on to the next movie, which is Hitchcock's I Confess. So Hitchcock's most Catholic of dramas follows a priest who hears the confession of a murderer, but refuses to break the sacrament and tell the police, even as they start suspecting him, the priest himself. So even to clear his own name, he will not break the sacrament and tell the police something he heard in confession. Thus, the film revolves around his refusal to do something rather than something he does do. But there's something really crucial to understand here. The character's refusal to do something becomes itself a declarative choice. So this story helps us make another distinction, which is that it is far more passive for a character to simply do what they're told to do, to go along with the path of least resistance. That's true passivity. To refuse to do something can itself be a form of activity. It is a moral choice. So keep in mind, activity is about choices. Next on our list is Being There. If you haven't seen Being There, you have to. This movie is so amazing. The character's name is Chance, played by Peter Sellers. Chance is a perfectly passive spectator for his entire life, until one day he's forced out of his home into the world. And though it's true that the character doesn't change much, he doesn't have a great revelation or anything like that, he maintains the same sort of voyeuristic relationship to reality. He's basically a spectator on his reality.
This is just like television, only you can see much further.
But he's not a blank slate of a character. He has desires.
May I watch television, please?
And he does things.
I'm a very good gardener.
Although it is true that the character of Chance has no real narrative intentions. He has no real goals. But this story helps us make yet another distinction, which is this. Narrative agency need not be intentional. Chance, without ever intending to, ends up reshaping his reality. And lastly, we have the film Fool's Paradise. Now, if you know anything about the debut film written, directed, and starring Charlie from Paddy's Pub, then you probably know the whole premise is that he's a passive protagonist. Essentially, Charlie is riffing on being there, and it's hard not to talk about the two films in conversation with each other. Charlie is transplanting the story of being there from the world of upper-class Washington, D.C. politics into the cultural hellscape that is Hollywood. But there's a main difference in how the two protagonists are conceived. Latte Pronto is actually a blank slate of a character. He has no lines of dialogue until the very, very end of the movie. He has no desires whatsoever, no worldview, no relationships, nothing. You can't ever register what he wants or how he feels or what he thinks about a situation. Whereas the character of Chance, despite being simple and childish, always had some kind of internality. You still could register his reactions to things. And he still, despite his simplicity, develops relationships. Chance remains an extremely endearing character, while Latte Pronto is anything but. But my counterintuitive argument here is that this failing of Fool's Paradise isn't actually a problem in the storytelling itself. The problem is the style. The problem is how the story was told. Fool's Paradise is a kind of Brechtian story. It is supposed to be distancing, defamiliarizing, avant-garde. It's not meant to be enjoyed in the classical sense. This character, Latte Pronto, is supposed to represent an idea. The idea that there is a lack, an emptiness, a big nothingness at the heart of Hollywood. It is simply, it's against Hollywood. It's an anti-Hollywood film. And yet it uses the language of classical Hollywood filmmaking to tell that story, to make that point. So the whole endeavor is sort of self-defeating. It's pulling the rug out from under itself. And as a result, it's never sure how it's supposed to land. It's not sure of itself. I, for one, am deeply grateful to Charlie, our Lord and Savior who died for our sins, for creating this terrible film, because it really helps us understand this lesson so clearly. The lesson is, you need an active protagonist. We enjoy spending time with an active protagonist, a character who's actually a character, who has a worldview, who has desires. We much prefer characters even who are morally repugnant, who are lost to the darkness, to a passive character. We love it when characters make choices, when they pick up and go, when they don't have time for questions, go, when they refuse to do as they're told, when they rebel against their mentors. So make your character do things. I mean, just think about how boring it would be if you're watching a Law and Order episode and the detectives were just sitting around waiting for the forensics lab to return some data to tell them who the culprit was, and that was it. That was the episode of them sitting around waiting, and then someone showed up and said, hey, here's who the culprit is, and they said, great, thanks. The end. Sucks.
Maybe the trace lab gives us a hair or splatter or something. But short of that, we're gonna have to go proactive.
Now here it might be helpful to talk about activity a bit, and like, what is activity? Is it enough to just have characters do business, like things that occupy their hands, like trying to get the ketchup out of a ketchup bottle? Those things, those are just the cherries on top. And when those actions are symbolic and emotionally charged, like this scene in The Sopranos, they just make a scene come to life and give it an electric energy. But that is business. That's not true activity. True activity is about choices that have consequences, irreversible consequences. So one huge one huge caveat to this universal rule that characters should be active is that characters don't have to always be active. Even the most active characters are often drugged, or they fall asleep, or they're taken prisoner, or they're forced to surrender for some reason. Activity is a spectrum, and characters do not stay in one place on that spectrum for very long. You just want to make sure that your character doesn't stay on screen too long when they're occupying the passive end of that spectrum. So on one end of that spectrum, we have passivity, where they're basically just a prop that follows the path of least resistance, goes wherever the world around them wants them to go. But on the other end of the spectrum is proactivity. And proactivity is where characters have very strong and clear desires. They are forward thinking. They come up with plans to achieve what they want.
Stop.
They might also encounter unforeseen obstacles and have to improvise. They might take risks and make difficult choices. That's proactivity. But what's in the middle of the spectrum? This is interesting. Here in the middle is actually reactivity. So to be clear, a reaction in a scenario can become the fuel for a character's next endeavor, like, say, revenge. But the reaction, that reactive mode, is the moment itself. It is how they feel when this information is revealed to them and what they do in the very next moments after that. Do they cry out in pain? Do they punch the wall? And even if the reaction is extremely strong, like to kill someone, that's still just an act that occupies one scene. That's what they do in that moment. That's not something they can spend a whole second act or third act of a film pursuing.
That's the man who killed my brother.
You're drunk and you're angry, in no condition to fight a professional soldier.
Revenge is a scheme, after all. It's an undertaking. You have to plan it out. Sometimes it takes years and years to get your revenge. Sometimes it takes 1,000 years to get your revenge.
At last we will reveal ourselves to the Jedi. At last we will have revenge.
There are phases to it. You have to prepare for it. So as soon as a reaction solidifies and becomes an undertaking that requires some commitment, multiple scenes to see it through, then it becomes proactivity. Then you've moved out of reactivity into proactivity. So keep in mind that proactivity is not about constant business. Sometimes proactivity is about patience, about doing nothing and waiting for an opening. Proactivity is all about foresight. It's all about desire. It's always about overcoming obstacles and keeping your mind on the one thing. There's a Kierkegaard quote, one second. Purity of heart is to will one thing, and purity of character is to move towards one thing. Also remember that sometimes a character needs a minute to become a protagonist. I'm not saying that your character should be proactive from the start, because we all do. We all need a moment to realize that we're not where we want to be. None of us begin life working the dream job or falling in love with the person of our dreams. We all need to strive to improve ourselves a little bit, to step out of our comfort zone, to get the most out of our lives. And sometimes a big traumatic event is like a nudge from the universe saying, okay, now it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Let's go. That's, in storytelling lingo, what we call the inciting incident or the call to adventure. But be careful, because just because something is true, like our shared journey from passivity as children to proactivity as adults, does not mean that it offers a complete basis for a compelling story. Don't bore your audience and yourself. Get your character out of that passive zone by the end of the first act.
I want to come with you to Alderaan.
Get them to commit to something and begin moving towards it. And even if they don't stay there in that place of focus, premeditative activity, you have to get them there for a time. If your character spends a long time on the passive end of that spectrum, then start the story shortly before the change comes, when they start becoming proactive. There's a phrase that Robert McKee uses that I love and I use a lot as well, which is about a story getting on its feet. He'll often say a story never really gets on its feet, or it takes too long for the story to get on its feet. So what does it mean when a story isn't yet on its feet? Well, you often get multiple inciting incidents. You might get something crazy happens to them and they go, whoa, this changes everything. But then they just go back to what they were doing before. Even if they feel different, they're not doing anything different about it. And hey, maybe that's what you want to explore. Maybe that's the sort of theme that you want to explore and the sort of feeling you want to explore, this feeling of life not really changing. There's some really beautiful works of art that explore this idea of cyclical time as opposed to linear progressive time. I think of a movie like Perfect Days. If you've seen Perfect Days, you know it's a really beautiful movie. It has a real pleasure to it. It's about the pleasure of these moments, these simple moments in life, and the pleasure of routine and the pleasure of repetition. And the film, therefore, has a lot of repetition. But the pleasure you get from that kind of story, that kind of movie, is about self-contained moments. It's about the texture of the moments, the feeling of the moment. It's not the same pleasure you get from a story, per se. And if that's your intention, then all the power to you. I just want you to be absolutely sure what your intention is, because it is really hard work to craft a compelling, emotionally rewarding story. It's really hard work. It's not simply about following some rules. And if you are on this journey with me, journey to storytelling mastery, then don't be passive. Go check out my website, request notes from me. And if you want to hear my opinion on the top 10 best tower defense games of all time, check out my Patreon, where I'll be posting that video. And until then, blessings of Akatosh upon you, and Todd Howard, where the hell is Elder Scrolls 6, dude?